This is a production of Cornell University.
All right, so my name is Amara Dunn, and I organize this session with my excellent colleagues Elizabeth Buck, Abby Seaman, and Marion Zuefle, who are also on this call, and you'll be hearing from them at different points during today's session. So we're basically going to cover three things in the next hour and a half. We're going to talk about what IPM is. We're going to do an overview of IPM tools, and you're going to spend some time thinking about IPM on your farm. And these last two pieces, the overview of IPM tools and the thinking about IPM on your farm, are going to be kind of intermixed. So it's not going to be a linear presentation. As I said before, please ask questions anytime in the chat. We want to make sure that we get your questions answered, and that's probably more important than covering the content that we've prepared. We will also be asking you to participate today. And we already appreciate your participation in the polling responses, but just be aware of that. We're here to help you participate. We know that sometimes that's a little bit harder on Zoom, but we want to help with that. And the reason that we include participation is we think that it helps you get more out of these sessions. All right, so we're going to go ahead and start with our breakout rooms and asking you to do some participation. There's a lot on this slide. Don't worry, I'm going to walk you through all of it. So in a moment, I'll be asking everyone to join a breakout room. And then in this breakout room, we'll be inviting you to take a look at that chart that I shared the link for in the chat when folks were signing on, and maybe Elizabeth or Abby or Marion can repost that link in the chat. So this is a chart that basically just has months of the year and a place for you to jot down what are you doing to grow tomatoes. So just a way to think about, sort of in a linear calendar-based fashion, what all is involved in producing tomatoes, because we know there's a lot. The link, you won't actually be able to type into that chart on Google Drive. You need to download it and edit it on your computer. If you let us know ahead of time that you were coming to the workshop, then I sent you that information in an email yesterday. And if not, you can get it. You can access that through the link in the chat. So in the breakout rooms, we'll ask everyone to kind of fill out that chart for themselves. And because you're in a small group, you'll have the opportunity to ask each other questions, including, wait, how do I get that chart? And how do I download something from Google Drive? Maybe folks can answer those questions too. And chat a little bit about what you do to produce tomatoes. Everyone's going to fill out their own chart so you can be focused on what you're doing on your farm. So the way that the breakout room thing is going to work is, in a moment, you'll see a little window pop up that says join breakout room. I'm not quite sure whose name is going to be here. It might be Kim's, it might be mine, but it'll say you're invited to join a breakout room. All you have to do is click the blue join button. I'll set a time limit on the breakout room, and it'll probably be around 10-ish minutes. When you get to the end of the breakout room, there'll be another window that'll pop up and say, you have 1 minute left. The breakout room is going to close in 60 seconds and it'll count down. At that point, you can either click this blue leave breakout room button, or you can just hang out. Automatically, the room will close when the timer gets to 0 and you'll come back to the main room. While you're in the breakout room, there is also going to be a blue leave room button. So if at any time you want to come back to the main room, you can do that, with the caution that if you click on this blue leave room button, it will give you the option to either leave the whole meeting, which you do not want to do, or leave just the breakout room. If you accidentally do leave the meeting, go back and find the link that you used to join the Zoom call in the first place, and you can get back in that way. So the 60 seconds has not yet expired, and I think here comes everyone. Someone in the breakout room I joined described this as an adventure, this Zoom environment, and I think that's a good way to put it, and I appreciate all of you for being good sports in our adventure. Hopefully you had that gave you at least some opportunity to think about, what do I do to grow tomatoes? Because we're going to spend the rest of today's session chatting about then your IPM toolbox for growing tomatoes. And as we go through the tools in the toolbox, you'll be invited to think about where do those tools fit into the things that you are already doing to produce tomatoes? So I always like to make sure that everyone is on the same page in terms of using the same definitions. It's really good if we're all talking about the same thing. So just really briefly, integrated pest management, or IPM, is all about managing pests effectively while minimizing risks. And those could be risks to human health, they could be risks to the environment, or they could be economic risks, right? Your losses to your bottom line, either because of pest damage or recognizing that managing pests has a cost. So IPM is also a holistic approach to pest management. This means that we're using a lot of different tools when we're doing IPM. IPM also involves not just reacting when you see a pest, but there's some steps that precede that. So IPM starts by preparing, knowing what pests you should expect and when to expect them, and also understanding the biology of the pests that you are expecting. When you are prepared and you know what pests you might be looking for, you can take some preventative steps. How can you exclude those pests from your field, from your greenhouse or high tunnel? What cultural practices will help? And how can you grow healthier plants? Looking to know when and if you have pests is a really important part of IPM. So scout early and know what level of pests or damage from pests you can tolerate. And we'll talk some more about scouting in a little bit. Step number 4 is making a plan. So knowing what your management options are if you find pests and they're exceeding your tolerance or your threshold, making sure you know how to use those management options and what the risks are. And these management options run the gambit from cultural practices up to chemical pesticides. And there's different risks with all of those practices: environmental, human health, and economic risks. Step number 5 is choosing and using a management option that will be low risk and also effective. And then it's really important to step back and assess how well your IPM plan worked, right? So that you can make changes next time. Really importantly, I find this encouraging as someone who is also trying to do IPM, not in a commercial production field, but certainly around my home and in my home garden. IPM is a journey and not a destination. There's always room to add some more IPM. And you are probably already doing some IPM. And so that, I think, is encouragement. You're probably already doing some, and there's probably room for some more. So some of you were able to chat in the breakout rooms. I know there were some technical difficulties with the breakout rooms, but what I would like to do is take a minute and ask folks to either put in the chat, probably put in the chat is the easiest. And I'm actually gonna type a little bit here so you can all see what are some things that you do to produce tomatoes and when do you do those things? And actually I have changed the settings so you can unmute yourself. If you would like to unmute yourself and just share, that is okay too.
Hi, this is Tony, Emmy. And pretty much in January and February, you start ordering seed and ordering other inputs. Those 2 months are pretty much what I do then, planning for seed and other inputs.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, my name's Bob Horsford. I've worked up some of the soil in my hoop houses and I've started some of my tomato plants. I have all my seeds that I'm gonna have for the year.
Great.
I just gotta start putting down plastic and biodegradable plastic, which is a godsend, even though it's more expensive. It's great stuff. So that's me.
Great. What are folks planning to be doing in April, May, and June? What do you anticipate you'll be doing?
Hi, this is Tony again. Pretty much in April, you were producing transplants in the greenhouse, finalizing, what production areas I'm going to use on the farm. And then in May, you're actually tillage and transplanting, putting plastic down. In June, you might, at times we'll transplant a late crop, And at that time too, we'll start, if not in May, start your spray program to protect against disease and insects.
And I also saw, so we've already got order seeds on here. Start planting in May. Anything we're missing? All right. Oh, we have someone who is grafting. Excellent. All right. So let's look at the second half of the year. So July, August, September, October, November, December. What's going on in tomato production during these months? And I realize we've got folks who are doing different kind of production, hoop houses, not hoop houses. Some people are grafting, some people may not be grafting. So it's okay, we've got a mix here. Oh, did my screen sharing stop? Apparently it did, yes. All right, well now you can see my screen again. Thank you for letting me know about that. Yeah, so July through December, what sort of things are folks doing with tomatoes then? See in the chat, someone planting in greenhouses last week. Excellent. Hoping for an early start this year. So for July, we have watering, applying calcium, and scouting for diseases. When do you all start harvesting? I'm sure this will be different depending on where you're growing. I'm gonna assume there's some harvesting that is going on in August. Also some pruning and trellising. Perhaps some watering happening in a lot of these months, depending on what the weather's like. I'm gonna add pest management, whether you're spraying for weeds or diseases or insects. There's probably some pest management here also. Does anyone want to share something that they're doing at the end of the season when harvest is done? Anything going on there?
Since I'm growing plants in a hoop house, it's a passive system. It's important after the plants are killed by frost that you clean out all the residue, because if you don't do it, you're setting yourself up for foliar problems the next season.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. Would that be October for you or a little bit later?
No, it'd be October.
Okay.
I'm usually out by October 10th, October 15th.
Okay.
It's cold here.
Yeah, sanitation is very important, and we will talk about that. I'm going to give folks one more opportunity if there's something you're desperate to add to our chart before we move on. And thank you for those who have been sharing in the chat and speaking up. Choosing and planting cover crops. Excellent. Great IPM practice. And someone else who's mowing everything down at the end of October and planting rye. All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for participating. I know this is not a typical thing we do in meetings, but I think it's a little bit more fun, at least it's more fun for me, than just me talking the whole time. So that's why we do this. All right, so the idea of having you share and think about what you're doing for tomato production at different points in the year, again, is so that we can make some connections between these IPM tools for tomatoes and things that you're already doing. So as Marion and Abby and Elizabeth and I go through the next slides, we'll try to make some connections to some things that were shared and encourage you also to be thinking about like, oh yeah, I'm doing that. Like maybe that wasn't on my chart, but I'm doing that already. Or I'm not doing that, but maybe that's something that I can add. So we're going to go ahead and start off with Elizabeth, who's going to talk to us a little bit about crop rotation.
Okay, hi everyone. So crop rotation is one of the most fundamental and easiest things that you can do for IPM. Pretty much everyone is already rotating the crops. It's the best way to break disease cycles. And as a general rule, you want to aim for 3 years between plants of the same family. So as you can see, these peppers and eggplants are the same family. They're always staying 3 years apart as they rotate around between the fields. A strong rotation can definitely help break disease cycles. It helps you move around and change your weed pressure, avoid certain types of weeds. Depending on how far you can rotate, sometimes can also help with your insect pressure. Overall, a strong rotation leads to a much happier, easier growing environment, in generally speaking.
Yes, so I'm up next chatting a little bit about sanitation, and this came up in some of the things that folks shared already, especially about cleaning up. Abby and Marion and Elizabeth and I were talking, and we felt like sanitation we could really summarize with just a lot of S's. So you want to get all of your S's. Surfaces. So for example, if you're producing seedlings in a greenhouse, you want all your surfaces, all your bench tops to be clean. Seedling trays, places where you're starting your tomato seedlings, those need to be clean or they need to be new, and anything else that's coming in contact with your seedlings. The seeds themselves should be clean. And this picture over here, I still am not able to say the name of this tool, but it is apparently a tool that is used in cooking that can hold a liquid at a steady temperature, which is great if you want to hot water treat tomato seeds, right? Because you need them to be at a particular temperature for a length of time. And apparently this tool can be really helpful with that. Snips, so any tools that we're using for pruning, anything that's going to come in contact with the tomatoes, those should be clean. And then this picture here, sous vide, Elizabeth is saying. Is that it, sous vide? I'm going to have to learn. I know no French at all. This is unfortunate. Elizabeth says yes, thank you. So this picture here is showing some sanitizing of wooden tomato stakes. Using your tomato stakes for just 1 year and then burning them if they're wooden is also a great way to sanitize them. But if you do need to reuse your tomato stakes, it's really important that you sanitize them in between seasons. So this means scrubbing all of the organic material, all the soil, plant debris off of them, and then soaking them in like a bleach solution that is going to kill any bacteria that could be overwintering. Abby's up next with pest-resistant varieties.
Good afternoon. So when we're thinking about the varieties that we're going to grow, of course, the first consideration is going to be what we can sell, what our market wants. But after taking that all into consideration, it's important to think about whether there is pest resistance in any of the varieties that you grow, and maybe you could favor those particular varieties. In these pictures here are a couple of varieties, one of which has late blight resistance and one of which doesn't. And this is plants from the same trial in the same year, so you can see the level of late blight resistance you can get with some of these varieties. And there are more late blight resistant varieties coming along all the time. So I think that's something to keep track of if you can. Meg McGrath combs the seed catalogs and her colleagues' trials looking for recording the disease resistance of different varieties of all the different crops. And you can find that information on the Cornell Vegetables website for each crop. And that's just vegetables.cornell.edu. And that website will be on our resource list.
So integrated weed management, weeds are a huge cost on vegetable farms, take a lot to control them. And I always like to say, it's not one single tactic. When it comes to controlling weeds, it's many little hammers. And that starts with knowing what weeds you have in your field and managing the weed seed bank. The idea is that if you can prevent seeds from going into the ground, you can start to get further ahead year after year. And you get further ahead also by knowing the life history of those weeds. So if you can identify the weeds, then you can learn what the weak points are in that weed's life cycle and attack that weak point. Cultivation is great because weeds do not become resistant to steel. We do have herbicide resistance for several of our weeds, including to some tolerances to some herbicides that we can use in tomatoes, but there's yet to be a weed that will survive a well-timed, well-placed piece of steel. Perennials will regenerate, but we can manage that. It's good to know what your crop's weaknesses are too. So we're talking primarily about tomatoes here, right? So tomatoes, they're in the nightshade family. That means that any weeds in that same family, nightshade weeds, are going to be less likely to die to the herbicides. If we have an herbicide that kills a nightshade weed, odds are it's going to be too tough on the tomatoes to use it. We know that with tomatoes, vining weeds are going to be a big problem because they will start climbing that plant, climbing stakes. The other thing that is a weakness with tomatoes is really tall, vigorous summer weeds, things like lamb's quarters and pigweeds and velvet leaf, because they like the same exact growing conditions. So everything we're doing to make our tomatoes happy also make those weeds really happy. And if you're staking your tomatoes, which a lot of people do, sometimes the layout of the field and the actual height of the stakes limits your ability to get in there and cultivate. So we get a lot of weeds on the edge of the bed. We get a lot of weeds late in the season. I always like to think about weed management and those many tiny hammers. Plastic mulch is great, but where's the fertility going? If you're feeding under the mulch through, say, a drip tape, that's awesome. You're denying the weeds their food. If you're broadcasting a lot of fertilizer out, then you're really only feeding the weeds in between the rows. So restricting down your fertility pattern can also be a weed management tool. And it's going to be an economic benefit in a year like this one. And the final question is, where are your weeds coming from? Is there a chance that you're bringing them in, say, with straw or hay mulch? Is a chance that you have brought them from field to field? Just are they blowing in on the breeze because you have a weedy section in the hedgerow or along a ditch? And I always like to put this picture out there. You know, God give the folks in Albion a pat on the back for trying to be positive, but weeds are not beautiful in your tomato field. Not at all. All right, Amara. So the next thing along the lines of fertility is it's really good to optimize the pH and fertility. It's all a question of balance, right? So if you have too little of any given nutrient, the way we talk about that and conceptualize it is a barrel. And every stave in the barrel, that's the planks in the barrel, is a different nutrient. You fill this barrel up with water. The lowest plank is where the water starts pouring out. And the water represents your yield, just like in this picture. So you can have all of your nutrient levels just perfectly fine where they need to be, but your yield will always be limited by the lowest insufficient nutrient, okay? The idea with this is that if you have too little of any given essential nutrient, the plants become stressed. A stressed plant is more disease and insect susceptible. And certain nutrients, particularly the macronutrients, you can get direct interference with fruiting and with fruit quality. Now, obviously, this idea of too little also applies to water stress, right? It applies to pH too. So if your pH is too low, those nutrients may be in the soil, but the plant isn't able to pick them up. They aren't freely available in the water in the soil. On the flip side, if the pH of your soil is too high, a different set of nutrients gets tied up and is no longer available in the water in the soil. This tends to be a common problem with tomatoes grown inside greenhouses, okay, inside high tunnels, where the pH raises too high and we don't have accessibility of the micronutrients. Those are more accessible at a little bit lower pH ranges. So with too much pH, too low pH, we have the nutrients in the field, but they aren't available. When we're just lacking the presence of the nutrients, they should be available, but they do not exist there. We have too little. If we have too much of any given nutrients, really lots of times we're only feeding the weeds. The crops don't take up luxurious amounts of nutrients. They don't gather more than they need. A lot of weeds do, they hoard it. And as they hoard it, they get bigger and bigger and you get more and more seeds. It can promote the presence of certain pests. It also can interfere with fruiting and fruiting quality, and it's environmentally irresponsible. So that's the too little, too much. There's also the timing of it. When plants get fed, they have a teenage phase, right? And just like teenagers, they will eat you out of house and home in this rapid growth phase. There's no point trying to prepare, 3 turkey sandwiches for a 5-year-old. They're not going to eat it. But if anyone has had a teenage boy in their house, they certainly know that 3 turkey sandwiches will disappear quite quickly. Your plants hit that stage right when they hit that rapid growth stage. That's when you want to feed them most of their nutrients. If you feed it too early or too late, you're causing stress, you're losing yield. If it's nitrogen, we tend to leach it. That's why we don't want to see a lot of nitrogen applied early. We want to hit that teenage growth phase. And particularly with tomatoes, the window of high need for potassium, which is directly related to fruiting and fruit quality, is going to be at first flowering through golf ball size of the first fruit, that's when you need to switch and focus on potassium. And the last thing is that you always want to feed a balanced diet. You know, this is an actual picture of my oversized house cat, and he's too tubby. We don't want our plants to be like that. We have macronutrients, micronutrients. We want to provide sufficient amounts of both, but it's a relationship about like this. You know, you need this many of the micros, you need way up here for the macros. You want to avoid deficiencies. At the same time, you want to avoid toxicities. A lot of the deficiencies and toxicities you're going to control by keeping your pH just right.
All right, optimizing the environment is what is being depicted on this slide. And I'll be honest, these are some pretty nice looking unstaked tomatoes. And I realize that there are some growing situations where leaving your tomatoes unstaked, that's what you do. But the reason that we stake tomatoes, a big reason that we stake tomatoes, is to get that foliage up off the ground. Not only does that reduce contact between the soil and the fruit, and if you've got some diseases in the soil, that can be a problem, but it improves airflow. So you're gonna get a lot of better airflow around these plants that are staked up off the ground than you will when the plants are leaning over and there's a lot of humidity here in this foliage. So obviously there's a lot of things about the environment we can't control, right? We can't control the weather, but thinking about what things you can optimize. And if you're growing in a high tunnel, thinking about how you're letting air move through, what pruning decisions you're making that are going to improve airflow, get some more air flowing around your plants, and make an environment that is better for your plants. Marion, you're up with Pest ID.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to cover the next 3 topics, which include the correct pest identification, scouting, and thresholds. So for an IPM program to be successful, you're going to have to know what pest you are managing for. And that is where this pest identification is critical. So here I'm showing you 4 different images of tomatoes. The damage seen on each one is different. 2 are bacterial. We have bacterial canker and bacterial speck. 1 is caused by a mite, the 2-spotted spider mite. And then the last one isn't caused by a pest at all, but was due to herbicide drift. So depending on what the cause is or what the pest is, that's going to determine what management you're going to use to control it, and if you even can control it. So if you mistakenly think that the herbicide damage was due to a disease, then your management of, say, using a fungicide obviously would not be successful. Not everything that you're going to find out there is a pest. Some insects are beneficial. And then there's also some symptoms that you're going to encounter that are due to abiotic causes, such as nutrient deficiency or herbicide damage, as seen in the picture, or drought stress. But when you do have a correct identification, then you can determine if, first of all, if it is a pest, what other crops or weeds might serve as a host to this pest, what life stage you want to try to control, whether the pest can overwinter, if there's any resistant varieties available, and then also if the pest has a threshold, and then all the management options that are available to you. So if you can go to the next slide. So I'm now going to cover scouting and thresholds. So to know what's going on in your field and whether there are any pests out there that you need to be concerned with, you obviously have to go out there and look. And you want to do this regularly, and this is called scouting. So ideally, to scout your fields, you want to go out there weekly so you can detect any potential pests before they become a problem. And by scouting weekly, you're also going to be able to see any changes that are occurring over the season. And then you'll learn when certain pests occur throughout the season. And you'll learn that if you're out there weekly and observing what's going on. So to scout, you're going to want to look at all representative parts of the field, including areas that may be a little bit different from the rest of the field, such as a wet spot or high or low spots in the field, areas near the edge or along the tree line, as you can see in the back of the picture. You also want to, when you're scouting, start at different parts of the field. You don't always want to enter the field at the same spot. So you really want to scout the whole field throughout the season. So one week you enter in the northern part and the next week you enter from the south. And also when you're scouting, you kind of do it to hit all parts of the field. You want to kind of do it in a V or a W-shaped pattern. Don't just walk down one row. And I know in tomatoes, this can be tricky if they're staked, but you really want to hit multiple rows throughout the field. And when you're looking at the plants, you're looking at the flowers, the fruit, the top and bottom surfaces of the leaves, both the upper leaves of the plant as well as the lower leaves, and then along the stems. And we usually recommend when you're scouting that you should stop at least 10 times throughout the field and look at several plants at that stop. Record the numbers of anything you're finding, your pests as well as the beneficials. It's important to kind of keep track of the numbers. Are they going up? Are they going down? If there are beneficials present, are they controlling your pests? Do you need to do something else? So by scouting regularly, you're going to know if a threshold has been met, but also you can assess if your control measures were effective, if you used any control. If you go out and scout, have the numbers going back down, or are they at least stabilizing? So the threshold that I just mentioned is the number or level of a given pest beyond which treatment is recommended. And the threshold can vary both by the stage of the crop, but also by what the pest is, obviously. It can also vary from year to year. And then it also depends on your own bottom line, what you can tolerate. So using thresholds before applying a pesticide can help you avoid these unnecessary sprays. And that obviously will save you time and money. Thresholds can be found in the vegetable guidelines and at the vegetable practices site of the New York State IPM website. And I'm going to post a link to that. You just have to copy it. I'll post the link to those so you can find your thresholds. And then we're going to move on to Abby about pest tracking and forecasting.
Yeah, pest tracking and forecasting can be thought of in some ways as another scouting or monitoring tool, kind of under the bigger monitoring umbrella. And it can be important for having early warning about certain diseases, so that you know that they're in the area before they actually arrive in your field. And a good example of that in tomatoes is late blight, which is can be a very devastating disease that you really want to be ready for before it arrives in your field. You really would prefer to not let it get there at all. So there is a national website that tracks the occurrence of late blight. It's called usablight.org. And you can sign up for text or email alerts from this website, so that, and you can define the area around your farm where you want to know that late blight has been found. So just this website, relies on people reporting where late blight has been found. So it can be a two-way street. You want to get the information from other people, and you also want to report, for example, if you are the first person in your county to find late blight, and if you're in an area with a regional vegetable extension program, the members of the staff of that program can help you with that. There are some tomato disease forecasts at also on the Network for Weather and Environment and Weather Applications, also called more easily NUA. And that NUA consists of a system of a network of weather monitors that are on farms, mostly owned by farmers, that take in weather data from those farms, usually temperature, relative humidity, and leaf wetness. And that information, like how long the leaves have been wet and what the temperature was when the leaves were wet, can be used to calculate disease forecast models that can help time fungicide applications. And there's also some insects that are tracked on the NUA website, but for cabbage and onions, not for tomatoes. Marion manages a sweet corn pheromone trap network that monitors for corn earworm, which is also AKA tomato fruitworm. And so that can be another source of kind of an early warning system. Corn earworm can be a pest of tomatoes, and it's very difficult to scout for. So the pheromone trap information can give you an early warning of when the corn earworm / tomato fruitworm moths are, the numbers are high. It's usually on years when the numbers are very high, and it's often late in the season when we start seeing them as a pest on something like tomatoes or peppers.
All right, this is me. So biological control using living organisms or natural enemies to manage pests is an important IPM tool. And there are different ways that we use biological control. So this middle one is showing releasing natural enemies of pests. And this might be the one that you think of first. So what you're seeing on this tomato plant here is little bits of probably sawdust or something else light that were sprinkled on the plant. What you can't see that are hiding in amongst that carrier is this predatory mite. And this is a predatory mite that is hopefully going to be eating two-spotted spider mite and controlling that pest on tomatoes. So this is something we think about a lot when we think about biocontrol. Oh, you're releasing good bugs to control pest bugs. But there are other aspects of biocontrol as well. So you might be conserving beneficial insects that are already around your farm. And so in this picture here, this looks like a bee, but it's not. It's actually a syrphid fly. And while the adults will feed on pollen and nectar and they're pollinators, the larvae, which don't look very impressive, are incredible aphid predators. And so having syrphid flies around your farm can you control aphid populations. This cute little insect down here is a pink spotted lady beetle, happens to be hanging out on this zinnia, but both adults and larval lady beetle, immature lady beetles, are great predators to have on your farm. And when you think about how you are conserving them around your tomato plants, this can include a couple of different things. So one aspect of conserving them might just be thinking about what you're spraying and recognizing that when you are choosing an insecticide, that insecticide could be not only killing pests, but it could be killing beneficial insects as well. And I'm sure you all think about that a lot in terms of bees and how to protect bees, but there are also other beneficial insects in amongst your tomatoes that you want to be conserving as well. If you want to take it to a next level of conserving natural enemies of pests, you could think about what makes your field a place where natural enemies want to hang out. And that could be a whole other talk of how you deliberately plant things that are going to feed and attract and keep natural enemies close to your tomato plants where they can be helping you out with pest control. And then over here in this picture, we've got a picture of somebody spraying because increasingly there are biopesticides that are available to control pests, whether they're insect pests or plant disease pests. These biopesticides, some of them are microorganisms, some of them are extraction plants, and some of them are naturally occurring chemicals. And so this is another piece of biocontrol. So this is kind of we put it as one tool in the toolbox, but there's really a lot of different aspects to biocontrol that could be part of your integrated approach to managing pests in tomatoes.
Okay, back to me. So when we get to the point, if we've scouted our fields and reached a threshold or have a reason from a disease forecast to start spraying, often we have some choices of pesticides, and we can think about how we can think about choosing among them to minimize the risk, both to the people who are applying the pesticides, as well as the impacts on pollinators and beneficial insects that Amara just talked about. So of course, we want to choose the most effective pesticide that we can always. But when we have a choice within of several or more effective pesticides, we want to take into consideration all of these different factors, including, is it something that's going to have the potential to move into groundwater? That's always a bad sign. Is it something that's going to have the ability to impact wildlife around your fields? So there are a few tools for comparing pesticide impacts. One is called the environmental impact quotient, and that is something that was developed many years ago within the New York State IPM program. And there is a calculator for for environmental impact quotient for different pesticides on the New York State IPM website. And the EIQ values are also for a given product are also included in the Cornell guidelines for commercial vegetable production. Another tool for comparing pesticide products, that's especially useful for herbicides, is called WinPST, and that's available through the NRCS. So if you're signed up for any National Resource Conservation Service programs, that might be a pesticide screening tool that you're working with NRCS to use to help you choose pesticides, especially herbicides, with the least environmental impact. The IPM Institute of North America has a pesticide risk tool that right now is available through a subscription, and it's similar to the environmental impact quotient in that it takes pesticide impacts on different potential targets, human targets, human impacts, beneficial impacts, risk of leaching into the groundwater, all those usual things that we're thinking about when we're trying to minimize the impact of our pesticides. And there is Amara has resources linked from her Biocontrol Bites blog, which has some information about different pesticide compatibility with natural enemies or beneficial insects. That can be especially useful in a greenhouse situation, but it can also, there's also useful information for thinking about your pesticide choices in the field, because whether you're releasing beneficials in the field or you're just trying to conserve the ones that are there naturally, your pesticide choices, especially insecticide choices, can be important. Oh, me again? Okay.
You have so much great information.
Oh, yeah. I'm talking about pesticides today, am I? So when we're thinking about pesticides, especially for herbicides these days, there are just so many fewer pesticides coming down the pipeline. I feel like it's really important to preserve the effectiveness of the pesticides that we have. And so we want to think about the way we use pesticides to manage pest resistance to them. So one way to think about this is to avoid repeated use of pesticides with the same mode of action. That applies for insecticides, fungicides, and herbicides. And you can learn what mode of action a pesticide has from the pesticide label. There will be information on the label as to what group a pesticide is in. So you can see this this is from a fungicide label. This particular one is group 13. And so you would want to not repeatedly apply pesticides from that same group in the same field in the same year. For insecticides, this can be especially important for especially small insects that have a lot of generations per year. You want to not apply insecticides with the same mode of action repeatedly to a pest population, especially those ones that have multiple generations per year, because you're selecting for the ones that have a little bit of resistance, and then those are the ones that reproduce. And then you end up with a population of increasingly resistant insects in your field. Using thresholds or forecasts to minimize your applications is another tool for managing pesticide resistance. The less pressure in terms of number of applications that you put on your population of weeds, insects, or diseases will minimize the what they call selection pressure for the resistant populations. If you can use a non-pesticide option, that's another way, again, to just reduce the number of pesticide applications that you apply. And then again, reducing the the selection pressure on your pest populations. Phew. Okay, go ahead, Amara.
So I have yet another question for you. I warned you up front you were going to be asked to participate. So we've talked about all these tools, and it would be very understandable if you're thinking, you know what, I know I should use all these tools, but it's hard. It takes a lot of time. I don't have the equipment. It costs money. So this is kind of your opportunity to do a little bit of maybe some venting. So what are the things that keep you from doing IPM? What makes IPM hard? You can go ahead and share your responses in the chat.
And I'll add that we really, really, truly do want to know what is difficult, because we can talk all day about how to do it, but if we don't know what's difficult, then we aren't really helping you that much, are we?
Question, are there resources? I am going to put the link for our resources in the chat. And so we have on here all of the links, I believe, that were mentioned today. And as I was listening to folks talk, I think I added a few. So that's the advantage of this being a Google document, is that we can add resources, but you don't actually have the ability to change anything on the document. So don't worry, you won't accidentally delete something, but you should be able to access the links. I did see that someone sent a direct chat message that they're not able to scout properly. I can imagine a few things that would make it difficult to scout properly. I know it takes time to scout. I know maybe there aren't personnel who are available to do the scouting, so that can definitely be a challenge for sure. And scouting does take time.
You know, I've had Amara, so I'm out and frequently making farm visits, and that's a really common thing that I hear, is it's just hard to get out and do proper scouting. And I always, when I talk with growers and hear that as a barrier, I always say, well, yes, there is the full blown version of scouting where you go to 10 spots, you look at 5 plants and you examine everything closely. But a little bit of scouting is better than no scouting at all. So if that just means that you walk the field once a week and that's a place to start, then that's great. You're starting on that IPM path and you found a way to do some scouting, and it fits with your restrictions and needs and time on the farm.
I also remember a grower who participated in this part of our school last year who just talked about making sure that her farm crew was able to recognize pests and kind of knew at least to alert her when they find something unusual when they're doing other things. So that's just another way. Whenever you're out in the field doing something, or whoever else is out in the field doing something, again, it's like a good first step to say, hey, there's something out here. I'm not sure what it is. Maybe we need to think about finding out what it is and, understanding if it's a problem or not, or just alerting the farm manager to that.
That's a great point, Abby. I see someone shared in the chat, if you're working full-time away from the farm, timing can be a big issue, especially trying to get your available time to line up with the weather. And that is 100% a big challenge. There was another direct message in the chat. It was a comment, when you scout for fungus, if you see it, you're probably too late. Abby, Elizabeth, Marion, does anyone have any advice or suggestions about that? Because that is a challenge.
I think I would say that can definitely be true for some fungal diseases, but different diseases have different epidemiology, or just different speeds at which they develop. And for tomatoes, I'll compare, for example, early blight, which is a very common disease that I think people generally see most years. I'll compare that with late blight. So the early blight, I would say if you are doing a decent job of scouting and can catch it when you're seeing the first symptoms, you'll probably do okay starting fungicides then. However, late blight, I would want to not find late blight, and then have that be my first response to putting on fungicides. I would always want to have fungicides there. So it does depend on the crop, and it depends on the mix of diseases. But yeah, I think that's definitely true for some diseases, and not just fungi.
And I'll add to that. I think when it comes to disease management, so much can be done now with your variety selection. And everyone's got their favorite varieties, right? So you may have a variety that you absolutely love that doesn't have late blight tolerance. I think it's a really good IPM practice to put a small portion of your field into something with late blight tolerance, especially if you are a grower who has, you work off farm and you have time constraints getting there and getting the scouting done. Or you're someone who doesn't want to be doing a lot of spraying and you only want to do as little as possible. And so for diseases especially, I feel like there are a lot of really good preventative or proactive management techniques. So variety resistance is one. Using some sort of mulch or barrier and staking your plants is huge for slowing down the pace of a early blight or septoria infection. It can help cut back a bacterial infection because all of those diseases are splashing up from the soil. So by putting a mulch down under the plants and getting the leaves up in the air where they stay dry, you can really slow the pace down. In terms of, is it too late? I think with late blight, that's really the only one where it's too late. With the rest of the diseases, if you're watching the lower part of the canopy, those lower leaves, you can catch it early. And a lot of it comes down to weather. If it's going to be hot and dry, absolutely, you can get control of that situation. If it's going to be humid, rainy, you're going to want to act pretty quick.
And someone had asked for links again to the information about tracking pests. And so I have a link for usablight.org and NUA, the Network for Environment and Weather Applications, and also the Sweet Corn Pheromone Trap Network reports that Marion puts out. And I think especially for late blight, because that's come up a few times, the part of the idea for this USA Blight site is to know when late blight is getting close so that you can take some preventative steps. Difficult to source alternative pesticides. That is a real challenge also. Another comment that was shared with me in the chat, and is actually a good segue to the next thing that I need to cover. Someone shared, so many of the diseases and bugs just look alike. How do you tell them apart? And fortunately for you, we have 2 more tomato sessions tomorrow that will address those very issues. So tomorrow, sign on at 11:45, content starts at noon. We'll be talking about annoying arthropods. So that's going to be insects and then things that have more than 6 legs, and weedy competitors. So we're talking about IPM specifically focused on insects and weeds. And then in the afternoon, starting at 1:45, we'll be talking about diseases and nutritional deficiencies. And we have some great experts who'll be joining us to chat about those things.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.